I'd like to spend a few moments with you discussing some of the issues that we in the Congress will be confronting. And to preface this, may I just retrace part of our history. During the Revolutionary War, that's about 200 years ago, the Continental Army numbered 30,000. The commanding chief was George Washington, and as history shows, we were successful. At the end of the war, after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Washington became the President of the United States. A Congress was formed, a judiciary was formed, and the people of the United States said, now is the time to cut down defense. George Washington pleaded with the members of the Congress to maintain a force of some significance to protect our shores and to make certain that commerce between the various states be carried out in a peaceful manner. The Congress responded, as it has with all the years following, and when the dust settled, the Continental Army of the United States consisted of 80 men. Study your history, you'll see it in the footnotes. 55 were stationed at West Point, where the military academy was located, and 25 in Pittsburgh, headquarters of the military. 80 men made up the Continental Army of the United States. Soon thereafter, the British interpreted this to mean that the United States had lost its stomach for warfare. And those of you historians would know that the British came back again, and this time sacked the national capital. Burned down the Capitol, burned down the White House. And then we built up our army again. That's our first war. World War I, we did our best to stay out. Then finally, it became inevitable that this was a world problem and not just a regional problem. And reluctantly, the United States went in. It participated in the last phases of the war, but in so doing, did mass together a rather large contingent of men and women to serve in our armed forces. In fact, it numbered about 2 million. For a country at that time, 2 million was a massive force. Then, as we did at the end of the Revolutionary War, once again the people of the United States, through their representatives, insisted that we cut down the military. And so we began cutting down the military rather precipitously. And on December the 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, nearly one half of the military of the United States was located on this island. In other words, our military numbered about 400,000, about 200,000 were found on this island. To show you the picture of our military just prior to December the 7th, when General George Patton, I don't know if you read about him, he was a great general during World War II, there was a movie about him, reported to Fort Benning in Georgia to take over the command of the United States Armored Corps, the Tank Corps. He had an inventory of 325 tanks. Unfortunately, over half of the tanks did not operate. It couldn't move. It just did not move. And so he called up the War Department and said, how about sending me some money? We need parts. The War Department said, we have no money in the defense budget. And so he said, well, I'll get it myself. He was the wealthiest general in the United States Army. He was from a very wealthy Virginia family. So he went to Sears Roebuck. This is also in the footnotes of history. He bought parts, revived the 325 tanks, and that became the Armored Corps of the United States. That's what we had on the eve of December the 7th. When General George Marshall, who later became the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, and as such had command over 12.5 million men and women, 2 years before December the 7th, he was called upon to report to Leavenworth, Kansas, to take over command of that fort. And what he found there were 200 cooks, clerks, and drivers. Over half of them had no rifles, no sidearms, and very few had any training. And so what happened on December the 7th should have come as no surprise to anyone. One of the considerations that the Japanese included in their war plans was the fact that the military of the United States had dwindled and was weakened. And it was felt that we were in no position to respond in any aggressive manner. Well, in World War II, at the height of that war in 1945, we had 12.5 million men in uniform, men and women. Then a great victory was won, and the world said, peace is upon us. And as one can anticipate, the people of the United States and the Congress said, let's cut down the military. That's the normal thing for Americans to do. Now the war's over, let's cut it down. And in 1946, we began cutting our military. And by 1949, from 12.5, it came down to 1.5 million. Then in 1949, they said we should cut further. So they cut that in half. And we had 400,000. On June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans looked upon this and said, the United States is a paper tiger. That's the very words they use. It's a paper tiger. And they crossed the 38th parallel. And that's history. And when President Truman responded to the call of the United Nations, all he had forward were the troops in Japan. We had occupation forces in Okinawa and also in the main island of Honshu. And so the first contingent that went into South Korea to hold back the North Korean tide were men that we took from Japan. Now these were clerks, stevedores, cooks. Most of them had had no training in the use of arms. Very few had any training in combat. To show you how bad it was, I was then a civilian. I was retired from the military in 1947. My rank at that time was captain, although I was just 21. And suddenly, in July of 1950, as I was preparing to leave Hawaii to go to law school, I got a call from the Commander-in-Chief of USAPAC, a general I had befriended as one of the leaders of the veterans organizations. And he handed me a piece of paper. He said, look this over, Dan. I looked this over and I was completely flabbergasted. I said, is this a joke? This was a paper putting me back into active duty. I said, you want me back? He said, yes, we have to train men to fight. We have to rebuild our army again. So I said, please, let me go to law school, and if you need me after that, I'll be very happy to comply with you. But that's how bad it was. And now we are told by military analysts that the first 10,000 casualties in the Korean conflict could have been minimized by at least 50% if we had sent men who were trained and properly equipped. But that's history. Now we have concluded a major war, the most expensive war in our history, the war against communists. It is true that very few lives were lost, but it did involve the total resources of the United States. In order to anticipate a battle, we had to build up a military, and we spent trillions. And so now, once again, we hear the cry, cut defense, the war's over. And it's become a very favorite pastime of politicians. If you go to New Hampshire, every candidate would try to outdo the other. No, I'll cut it 50,000. No, I'll go 60,000. I'll go 70,000. Even the president is getting into the act. Where do I come in on this? I'm chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee. It is my committee's responsibility to finance the Defense Department. We are the ones who decide upon how many men we will have, how many women we will have, how many tanks, how many naval vessels, how many aircraft. And everyone's looking at this committee now. And they're saying, well, let's cut that and use it here for education. Let's cut this and use it here for health. Use it here for something else. I'm in favor of cutting down defense because I think with the change in circumstances, reductions can be made. But I've been cautioning my colleagues that the reduction at this stage should be done prudently and with some deliberation. Because though we have come out victorious in this war against the communists, we are now faced with another set of enemies. I'm not one of these boogeyman type people, believe me. But the enemy is what I call uncertainty and instability. And let me give you an example that all of us were involved in just a few months ago. In January of 1990, which is just a few months ago, as chairman of the committee, I received a call from the Pentagon telling me that they were in the process of retiring General Schwarzkopf. I suppose most of you have heard of General Schwarzkopf. He was the commander-in-chief of Desert Storm, the big hero. He was in charge of Central Command. We have many commands. This is the Pacific Command. You have the Atlantic Command, the European Command. The Central Command is one that has those floating ships filled with supplies, tanks, what have you, for contingencies. And they were primarily concerned with that portion of the Middle East. That was his jurisdiction, the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, the Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel. That's his jurisdiction. And they were in the process of dismantling the Central Command, sending half the forces to the European Command and half to the Southern Command. That's the command in Panama for South America. I was concerned with what Mr. Saddam Hussein was doing. Keep in mind that as chairman of this committee, and also as the first chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I have been privy to the secrets of this land almost on a daily basis. I have to report to an enclosed room to receive information. And the information that I was receiving on Saddam Hussein couldn't help but get me concerned. And here was the general who had Saddam Hussein in his jurisdiction. And so I called up the Secretary of Defense and I says, this is foolishness. I first called up General Schwarzkopf. He came to my office and he confirmed it. He said, yes, they're going to retire me. So they decided to postpone the retirement and the dismantling for a year. On the same month, the Department of Commerce of the United States, that's a major department, made plans to have a fair, a trade fair to sell aerospace technology and computer technology. Where? In Baghdad. So, to my horror, I called up the Secretary of Defense and I said, do you realize what your brother is doing in the Commerce Department? He's sending invitations now to the aerospace industry to go to Baghdad to sell Saddam Hussein some of our aircraft. He said, oh. So that was set aside. Several of my colleagues went to Baghdad to meet Saddam Hussein, and you may have read their accounts in the papers, returned praising Saddam Hussein, that here was a hope of the Middle East. Here was a man of peace. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand that, because here was a man that did something that even Hitler would not dare do, and that was use gas. In World War II, Hitler could have used gas, but he did not. We had signed an agreement after the end of World War I that we will not use gas. Saddam Hussein used it against the Iranians, against the Kurds, against his own people. In June of 1990, I introduced a measure to impose economic sanctions. When I did that, I got a call from the Republican leader, the President of the United States. Please withdraw that bill. After all, we think we can deal with this guy. 1 week before August the 2nd, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs held a hearing. They invited the Secretary of State. He wasn't around, so he sent his first deputy there. The committee was concerned with the massing of Iraqi troops on the Kuwaiti border. I don't know if you remember that. And so the question was, what will the United States do if the Iraqis cross the border? That's a good question, isn't it? The first answer was, we do not respond to hypothetical questions. Then the chairman tried it again. What if they cross the border? What do we do? The answer was, Mr. Chairman, there is no mutual security treaty existing between Kuwait and the United States. So on August the 2nd, he crossed the border. I cite this as an example of uncertainty and instability. Less than a year before the war, our leaders were convinced that Saddam Hussein was the potential savior of the Middle East. On August the 3rd, he became the Hitler of the Middle East. Now, if you ask me, what is Kim Il-sung going to do in North Korea? I will have to tell you, I don't know. I know that they're having discussions between the North and the South, but I also know that they have one of the largest military forces in that part of the world. I can't read their minds. If you ask me, what will be the outcome in Cambodia? My answer will have to be, I hope for the best. Yes, I hope for the best. Well, I have no idea what will happen. I know certain things. Right now, certain countries like Iran and Iraq and Libya are sending feelers to nuclear scientists in the Soviet Union, inviting them to their country. There are over 10,000 nuclear scientists, and soon they'll be out of work. They'll be looking for work. And if you think this is no problem, let me take you back a few years to the end of World War II, when the Soviet Union and the United States and Britain and France scrambled all over Germany trying to get their scientists. How do you think we got Werner von Braun, the man who sent us to the moon? We hired hundreds of German scientists. And I think it will be safe to assume that the scramble will begin again. It is true that the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the missiles that can fly from the Soviet Union to the United States, strategic missiles, are for the most part under control because most of it is in Russia, the new Republic of Russia. But the tactical ballistic missiles, those are the small ones. They're on tanks, some are on trucks, some are artillery shells. Many of them are found in the outlying areas. If you should ask me now, what is the future of Boris Yeltsin? My answer would be, I hope for the best. That's what I mean by uncertainty. I want to make certain that everything possible has been done before I vote to send any one of you to battle. I've been in war. There's nothing glamorous about war, believe me. It's painful, it's dirty, it's disgusting. In fact, I was severely criticized that as chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee, I voted against giving the President of the United States authority to conduct a land war. Remember, he wanted authority to conduct a land war? I visited him. I said, Mr. President, I want to see you. So I went there with the minority leader, Mr. Dole, just the two of us and the President, Mr. Scowcroft. And I said, please, Mr. President, why don't we let the sanctions work? We just put them in place. I said, Mr. President, Mr. Gorbachev has just announced that he's ready to send his emissary to Baghdad. Mr. Mitterrand has just announced that he is ready to send his emissary to Baghdad. Why don't we give those two countries an opportunity of sending their emissaries? After all, this is not an American war. This is an international affair. It is by order of the United Nations that we went in there. Well, he figured he had the votes. He had 2 votes extra. If I'm not willing to send my son, why should I be willing to send somebody else's son? I was sincere in my belief that we should have permitted Mitterrand to send his man and Gorbachev to send his emissary. Now you and I will never know what would have happened. Well, one can argue and say that the odds are nothing would have happened, knowing what Saddam Hussein is all about. But I would never know. But some of you may recall, as soon as the ground war began, I was interviewed by the press, and they asked me, how long do you think the ground war will last? And I came out and said 5 days. And I got letters from Hawaii saying, Inouye has blown his mind. I'm chairman of this committee. I know what we are providing our men. I know what divisions were sent there. The divisions that were sent there were the ones that were facing the Russians, the best trained that we have. We had weapons that had been tested but never in warfare. And if they performed the way they were tested, Saddam Hussein had no chance whatsoever. Well, the war ended in 4 days. So I'm going to do my best to preside over the cutting down of our military, but hopefully in a prudent fashion. I know that I can make a lot of political mileage and say, let's take off $10 billion here and turn it over to education, $15 billion here for health. There's another aspect of defense budget that is very seldom discussed. The effect it would have upon the community. What you see in the paper is a cutting down of troops. In 5 years, our plan at the present time is to cut our forces by 25%. It's 1/4. The president has announced that he wants to cut that further. All right. Others have said to cut it further than that. All right. Now, we have gone through painful exercise for 2 years now in closing bases. Hawaii is fortunate. We have not had to close a base. But when they close bases in other states, 15,000, 20,000 men and women out of work. Suddenly, bingo, gone. Pearl Harbor gets closed up, and I suppose some of you would not be going to school. We have not had any base closure in Hawaii. We're lucky. We've had additional personnel brought in. I feel for my colleagues. Now let's say that you live in Palmdale, California. What is the significance of Palmdale, California? It is a little town that supports Northrop. Northrop makes the B-2. Everyone has said, cut down the B-2, cut down the B-2. It's been the favorite cry of the nation. We are going to cut down the B-2, and we're going to close the line. When that line is closed, it will mean approximately 50,000 men and women out of work. If it's just 50,000 men and women, that's bad enough. But when you consider that as a result, mortgage payments will not be made, SNLs will have problems, banks will have problems, the laundries will have problems. Who's going to go dry cleaning now? Restaurants will have problems, the florists will have problems, the whole town will have problems. We have an unemployment rate now of 7.1. But don't let that mislead you, because all it says is 7.1% of men and women who have applied looking for work and cannot find work. They do not include those who have already looked for work, but they have used up their unemployment compensation. They're not included in the calculation. They do not include in the calculation those men and women who have said, nuts, I give up. What the numbers are, I'm not certain. But it's high. This much we know. Last year, 1.5 million men and women found themselves out of work, temporarily, short-term, or long-term, as a result of the closing of defense or defense-related activity. Give you another more personal side of cutting down the military. If you should decide to join the military, you would sign up for 4 years. The recruiter will see you and you'll sign up for 4 years. And you would consider that a contract for 4 years. I'm signing up today and I'm going to be in the military in uniform for 4 years to undergo the discipline of the military, and in return they'll pay me this and they'll do certain things for me. Well, if you're going to cut the military, you cannot just cut privates, nor can you cut generals. You have to have a balanced military organization. So you're going to cut right across, which will mean involuntary separation. So you're signed up for 4 years. As a general rule, a young man or a young lady who signs up for 4 years, at the end of 3 years, would ask that question: should I stay on or should I get out? And if you should decide to get out, then you've got a whole year to look for work. And when the moment comes when you shed your uniform, the chances are you'll have a job waiting for you. However, as part of the reduction in forces, hundreds of men and women returned from Desert Storm and within a month got their pink slip. None of them had an opportunity to look for work. What happens? One, on the ledger, on the defense side, it will show a reduction in the budget. We have cut troops, we have cut procurement, we've cut acquisition, we've closed bases, so there's a reduction in the budget. Our budget does not concern itself with unemployment compensation. Somebody else pays that. Our budget does not concern itself with food stamps. Somebody else does that. Ours has nothing to do with workman's comp or welfare payments. Another department takes care of that. Or the states or the counties would take care of that. Well, and sadly, there's a correlation between unemployment and the crime rate. Whenever unemployment goes up, experience has shown us that crime goes up. Because there are some people in utter desperation, in order to feed themselves or their children, would commit crimes. whether it be selling their bodies or stealing. So it is not an easy job. It's not just cut down 5 billion. It takes much more than that. So if you find the Congress may be resisting this fast, expeditious reduction in our forces, I hope that you will understand. Any questions? Maybe I'll tell you something else. I'm also chairman of the Select Committee on Indian Affairs. It is not considered an important committee. In fact, for a long time, members avoided service on that committee. And yet there was a time in our history when the Indian Committee was a very important committee. 200 years ago, both houses of Congress had major committees called Committee on Indian Affairs. Today, the Senate has a committee, the House has no committee. Not even a subcommittee. 200 years ago, after the new United States of America was established with the executive office, the legislative branch, judicial branch, the United States began to conduct itself like a sovereign and began having relations with other countries and nations. There are many ways of conducting diplomatic relations. One is through the treaty. We have treaties with every country on this globe. Soviet Union, but that's no longer, so now we have to have new treaties with Ukraine and the Baltic states and Russia. "200 years ago, Indians were very important to us. After all, this country belonged to the Indians. This year, we observe the 500th anniversary of the coming of Columbus. Indians are not celebrating this, believe me, because it's a sad day for them when the first European came to the Western Hemisphere. At that time, anthropologists suggest that there were at least 10 million Indians living in the continental United States. At least 10 million. Some go as high as 100 million because of the difficulty in taking a census. And as those of you who have studied Indian history would recall that in the wintertime, many of the tribes would follow the herds down to the south, to Mexico. In the summertime, go up to Canada. So it depends on the time of the year. But let's say you had 10 million. That's a sure bet. 10 million Indians, and we entered into treaties with Indian nations. Indian nations are sovereign. It is so declared in our Constitution. The Supreme Court has ruled on several occasions on the sovereignty of Indian nations. And so we have dealt with them as sovereigns. In the early days, Indians sent ambassadors to Washington. It must have been a grand sight to see elegant men with headdresses and robes coming into Washington, meeting the President of the United States, presenting their credentials. And so we entered into 800 treaties with Indian nations. This is part of the sovereign exercise. The Senate of the United States has the responsibility of ratifying treaties. We ignored 430 of them. But we told the Indians, you will abide with your promises. We ratified 370 of them. And we said, these 550 million acres of land shall be yours into perpetuity. I wish I had one of those treaties here with me, because they're eloquent documents. You very seldom see documents like this. As long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and the rivers flow from the mountains to the ocean, this land will be yours. That's perpetuity. Today they have less than 50 million acres of land. Today there are less than 2 million Indians. After the nation began to grow and more land was required, we adopted policies to either exterminate or push the Indians west of the Mississippi. If you study history, you will learn of the Trail of Tears. The most famous one is the Cherokee, where they were taken from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and in many cases shackled, and they had to walk all the way from there to Oklahoma, their final destination. By the time they arrived there, less than 10% survived. Why? Because they were taken during the summer and they traveled during the winter. Imagine you walking with shorts in Minneapolis today. You won't last half a day. That is our history. It's a sad history. Today our unemployment is 7.1. In Indian country it's 57%. Our suicide rate is high, but this may interest you. Among Alaskan natives, Alaskan Indians, among young men between the ages of 18 to 23, the suicide rate is 20 times the national norm. In Alaska, there is no history of alcoholic consumption before the coming of the European, because you don't grow anything in the Arctic Circle to make alcohol. And yet alcoholism is about 20 times the national norm. But we try our best to hide it. Well, I hope that in your history studies you will study Indians. And my last thought to you is, Indians did make a contribution to us, not only feeding us on Thanksgiving Day. They also were responsible for saving Washington and the troops at Valley Forge. If you really study history, it will show that the Indians were the ones who brought the food there. But the most magnificent contribution that they made was one that most Americans never think about. A few months ago, we all paused to celebrate the 200th anniversary of our Constitution. Most Americans did not pause and ask themselves, where did our founding fathers come up with this grand plan of the executive, the legislative, the judicial? You know, this, because if you look at the history of this world at that time, there were no democracies, nothing to copy, nothing. But suddenly, our founding fathers came up with this brilliant idea. If you read the letters and writings of Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson, you will get a clue. They were intrigued by the government plan of the Iroquois. That's where they got it from. The Iroquois nation is made up of 6 tribes, 6 nations. It's a confederation. And long before the coming of Columbus, they had set it up so that each clan or each nation elected its own chief, elected its own tribal council, that's the legislative council, elected its judges. Then each nation elected representatives to the central council. And they all got together and voted for the supreme chief. But there were differences. One, from the earliest of time, women voted. And in the selection of the supreme chief, only women voted. See, they were smart. See, they figure if you leave it up to men, men would select macho fellas, you know, all that fighting business. But if you leave it up to a woman, she's going to be concerned about what she's going to do about children, about shelter, about clothing, about food, education. And to this day, that's the way the Iroquois nation operates. And that's where our founding fathers set up this democracy. So you can thank the Iroquois. Thank you very much.
Thank the Senator for making history so alive for this last 50 minutes. And I was sad after the Trail of Tears part, weren't you? And I thought, oh, it's so wonderful to have heard him, but I feel so depressed. And then he put in that Constitution part. Now I feel uplifted. And I thank you so much for ending on such a positive note. Thank you all for coming.